The ancient faith for the modern world. This is Ancient Faith Radio.
Search the Scriptures as Christ our God said in the Gospel.
This is Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Join us for an interactive verse-by-verse study of the Bible with one of Orthodoxy's most respected biblical scholars. Study along with us and share your comments and questions by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Dr. Jeannie Constantinou.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father, who is from everlasting, and thine all-holy and good and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. One more prayer for this evening. The Apologikion of St. John Chrysostom. Grace shining forth as a beacon has illumined the universe and shown unto us the riches of uncovetousness and the height of humility. Wherefore, teaching us by thy words, O Father John Chrysostom, intercede with Christ the Word to save our souls. St. John Chrysostom's feast day today. Today is November 13th, 2023. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, and welcome to Search the Scriptures Live. And I also put St. John Chrysostom over there behind us. He is one of the most important fathers, certainly in the Greek tradition, in the Eastern tradition, the most important fathers when it comes to the interpretation of the Bible. And he is one of the people that we rely on quite a bit in this program because of the many sermons that he gave on various books of the Bible. And of course, what is he famous for besides his amazing life of virtue and the fact that he was truly a person who lived what he claimed to live? He didn't just talk about the gospel, he lived it. And there are plenty of preachers who talk about the gospel, but they don't really live according to the gospel, but he did. And of course, his famous saying was, "Glory to God for all things." And this is a wonderful saying, something for us to remember, especially when we're going through difficult times. Okay, so yes, we are studying the Gospel of Matthew. Today is November 13th, 2023. As I said, this is lesson 49 on the Gospel of Matthew in our series here on Search the Scriptures Live. We are beginning chapter 12 today, and I wanted to kind of remind you of where we are in the gospel. I'm not so sure that everybody appreciates this, but I'm the teacher here, so I'm going to make you try to remember the content of the gospel up until now, because there are two gospels that are relatively easy for you to remember where a story is, and they're John and Matthew. John is absolutely the easiest gospel to remember the content of, and when we were doing John's gospel, I was continually asking you to remember what was in each of the chapters. I don't know if you still do, but you can quiz yourself and you could try to remember these things. It's good to work on actually learning and mastering this information that I'm giving you, and not just listening to it and saying, "Oh, isn't that interesting?" and then forgetting about it the next day. You know, this is one of the things that St. John Chrysostom used to complain about. He used to complain to his congregation because they were complaining to him. They were complaining to him. Whenever we come to church, it's the same thing over and over and over. And he said, yes, it's the same thing because you still haven't learned. That's what he would say to them. And he said, after all these years, you should be teaching others, but you have us here and you have us chained here telling you the same things over and over and over. So this is exactly what he experienced as a pastor, that people were listening and they were appreciating his eloquence and his lessons, but they weren't really retaining what he said. And he also often would review what had come before so that they understood what he was talking about in its context. This is one of the most important things he talks about continually, understanding the scriptures in their context. So here we are in chapter 12 out of 28 in Matthew's Gospel. So we're more than 1/3 of the way through, not quite half of the way through. And I want to remind you about what we have already discussed, and you can see or try to follow along and remember what we talked about in each of the preceding chapters. So let's talk about, first of all, the general structure of this gospel. You should know this by now. I have mentioned it quite a few times. The main section of St. Matthew's Gospel is divided into 5 parts. There is an introduction, however, that's the infancy narratives. We're not counting that as part of the 5 parts. And then there is a closing, which is the passion and resurrection narratives. Altogether, he has 7 parts, which is a significant number, in the Jewish mind. So there's the introduction, the infancy narratives. That's about the birth of Christ. That's chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1 is the genealogy, talks about the birth of Christ. Chapter 2 has Herod the Great, the Magi coming to Herod, the flight to Egypt, the massacre of the innocents, and the return from Egypt. Then we have the first of the 5 sections. Now, every one of the 5 sections that form the center of Matthew's Gospel is divided between first narrative, that's the story, and then teaching, where Jesus just talks. All right? So it goes narrative, teaching, narrative, teaching, narrative, teaching 5 times. All right. So the first narrative section, the first section it starts with a narrative. That's chapters 3 and 4, because the infancy was chapters 1 and 2, right? 3 and 4, what happens? 3 is the preaching of John the Baptist and Jesus coming to be baptized. 4 is the temptation in the wilderness and the choosing of the 12 disciples. And then after that narrative section, we have a teaching section, which is very extensive. Chapters 5, 6, and 7. You should know what this is by now. The Sermon on the Mount. I won't break down what's in every chapter, but it includes a lot of important teaching on what it means to be a disciple. So when that marks the end of the first section, the second section begins on what it is. What is it? Narrative followed by teaching. Section 2, the narrative is chapters 8 and 9, which are what? 10 miracle stories in a row. So first of all, I want you to appreciate how Matthew has crafted his gospel. And I have not gotten into any of the nitty-gritty of the details, but let's just take those 10 miracle stories in a row, chapters 8 and 9. Now, those are actually divided into three groups of 3. Again, 3 is a significant number, 3 groups of 3. And why? But there's 10 miracles. There's 3 groups of 3 because one of them has 2 miracles. It's a sandwich. Do you remember that? Which story is the sandwich? It's the healing of the ruler's daughter. He raises her from the dead, and on the way, he heals the woman with the hemorrhage. Remember, that's kind of a double. So there's 10 miracles, but 3 groups of 3. Now, when Matthew was writing his gospel, he didn't say, now I am writing chapter 8. He didn't add chapters. We see in the way he describes the progression of the gospel that he has created these markers through his language. And I'm continually pointing that out to you. The teaching sections are marked by Matthew saying, when Jesus had finished saying everything he wanted to say, he got up and went through all the cities and towns or whatever. But he shows us, Matthew does, by his language, that this section is over and he's starting a new section. Okay? Likewise, he shows us there's a transition at the end of each of those narrative sections. Okay, so 8 and 9 are 10 miracle stories, 10 healings and other things like that. And then he stops at the end of the narrative and he teaches in chapter 10. Chapter 10 is called the missionary discourse. He concluded everything he had to say there. And at the beginning of chapter 11, we saw the transition to the next narrative section. We finished chapter 11. What is that about? That's about the messengers from John who asked whether or not Jesus is the one who says who they were expecting. Then Jesus praises John. He pronounces woes on the cities of Galilee that did not respond to the message. He thanks God the Father for revealing these things to the simple and the babes and hiding them from the educated and the learned, and invites everybody to come to him, all those who are heavy laden. He will give them rest. That's how chapter 11 ended. That we are now, in other words, in section the narrative section of the third main part of the gospel. In other words, we're heading toward the height of the gospel, the center point of the gospel, which is very significant for Matthew. So we've started section 3. We're in the narrative section of section 3. Now we're going to do chapter 12, which is still narrative. And the next chapter 13 is teaching. And I won't tell you yet why that is a significant section. Okay, because now we're going to talk about chapter 12. So what's going on here in chapter 12? The Lord is following, remember what he said in chapter 11, how he makes criticisms of this generation. They're like children in the marketplace who cannot be satisfied. He gives the example of John, who was very strict, lived an ascetic lifestyle, and said, if you like that form of preaching, of lifestyle, then follow John. But Jesus was not strict. And he was criticized for eating with tax collectors and sinners. And he says, if you want somebody who's not so strict, you can do it my way. But people weren't satisfied with either one. And really, he's talking there about the Jewish leaders who criticized both John and Jesus. And they both said they have a demon. Okay, it says in chapter 12 that they criticized John and said he had a demon. Okay, so it wasn't just Jesus that they criticized, but John also. So now in chapter 12, we're seeing an increase in the criticisms. We're seeing a kind of an intensification of those criticisms. That's what we're going to see here. And it begins with the Pharisees criticizing the disciples for picking grain on the Sabbath. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about that. First, I'm going to read to you. This is chapter 12 of Matthew's Gospel, verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. He said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? And those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for priests. Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would have not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Wow, that's quite a claim the Lord just made, that he is Lord of the Sabbath. So let's start with the fact that the disciples are going through the grain fields and they're beginning to pluck the grain. Sometimes this is translated as corn. Now, we know that corn is a New World crop. They didn't have corn there. They had barley, they had wheat, but you should know that corn is kind of considered a generic term for whatever the local grain was. Okay, so that's why the RSV has translated it as grain. Okay, so now most modern people find this objection a little bit unusual because they're objecting to the fact that the disciples are cutting the grain and cleaning it before they eat it, rather than criticizing the disciples for stealing, okay? Because that's what we would think. They're walking through an orchard or a grain field or whatever, and they're eating this produce that does not belong to them. So why didn't the Pharisees criticize them for stealing the grain that clearly didn't belong to them? Because the law of Moses, and we're talking about actually within the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 23, it allows people who are walking through an orchard or a vineyard or a field to eat the produce that's in that field that is growing there. That was allowed by the Old Testament law. And they were not allowed to harvest it. They couldn't take it and put it in their bag or, in the folds of their garment and walk out with it. But they were allowed to eat it as they were passing through. Now, why is that the case? It's quite remarkable, really. There are many, many provisions like this in the Old Testament law, which we think of as very severe, very strict, but actually, as compared to the laws of other ancient Near Eastern civilizations, the laws in the Bible are extremely humane, okay? For example, the punishment is the same for everyone. When the law requires a punishment for something, it's the same for everyone, regardless of whether you're rich or poor, or whether you're the king or a pauper or a commoner or something like this. Of course, they didn't have kings at the time when these laws were written. But in other words, everyone is treated equally. And that's not the case with other ancient Near Eastern law codes, like the Code of Hammurabi, which many people say, oh, they just copied those laws from other ancient codes, like the Code of Hammurabi. No, because the Code of Hammurabi had different kinds of punishments depending upon whether you were wealthy or poor. The punishments were worse for the poor people. Okay, so the laws in the law of Moses were very humane. And for example, another law, only the wrongdoer was actually punished for what they did. They didn't punish the whole village or the whole family. And that also was quite a remarkable thing. We don't even see that in some of the societies today. When somebody does something wrong, they punish everybody, that's in the village or everybody in the family. So even though we think of the Old Testament laws as harsh, and they are as compared to what we know as Christians, we have to appreciate that in their day, they were considered very advanced and very humane. Okay? All right. So this is one of those laws. They were allowed to eat of the produce in a field as they were walking through it. So they couldn't do any takeout, but they could eat as they walked through. Now, why is this? Here again, when you think of something in the Bible and it seems not right to you, you have to stop and think about how people actually lived way back in those days. Was there a 7-Eleven where they could stop and buy a sandwich or get a soft drink? Was there a McDonald's that they could drive through? Was there even a restaurant anywhere? No, these things did not exist. Maybe in the city they might have that, but here we're talking about people who are walking from one town to the next in a rural area. There's no place to get food. And so this concession was made as a recognition of the reality of the situation. So they were allowed to eat. This is from the fruit and the vegetables and the grain that they found in the field. But they couldn't walk away with some. That would not be fair. But that they could, that's just how it was. And there were other things too. There are other provisions for the poor that are in the laws that are in the Old Testament, etc. Anyhow, so let's get to what they are being criticized for. That's what they're not being criticized for. So it was unlawful, however, to do that on the Sabbath because that was considered work. It was like harvesting. They were picking the grain, bundles of grain, and they were cleaning it and they were eating it. So the Sabbath law required the Jews to refrain from all kinds of work. And this is even from what we would consider that something that is not work. Something even today, there are jobs that are forbidden or actions that are forbidden to law-observant Jews because it is how the law is applied modernly. For example, one of the forbidden tasks on the Sabbath was to make a fire or to gather wood for a fire. So you were supposed to have all of these things done by Friday before sunset so that you didn't have to do that on the Sabbath. You would just relax. You did no work. Well, the modern equivalent of that is turning on a stove or turning on a light switch in a room. We wouldn't consider that to be work, just to flick on a light switch, but that's the modern equivalent of starting a fire. So that is not allowed, even though it just means pushing a button. So even though, for example, you're not allowed to carry anything on the Sabbath, can you be carried? And the answer is no, you cannot be carried on the Sabbath either. So if you are to go to Israel, wouldn't it be nice if someday we can return there, if they stop the war there? Currently, it would be great to be able to go back. If you go to a hotel in Israel, the elevator will stop at every floor and you just wait till it comes to your floor, and it's going to go up and down continuously on a Sabbath setting because they're not allowed to, observant Jews, not all Jews are observant, but observant Jews will not push the button that tells the elevator to open its doors or tells it to take them up to whatever floor they want to go to, because that's the equivalent of carrying something or being carried. Okay, that would, in that case, themselves, all right? So the Sabbath law was a law that was given by God for the human race, not to create problems for people or technicalities, but out of the love of God for humanity. And I want you to think about, again, what I just said about how progressive this was, how remarkable it was that this law existed, because no other culture had this law. Think about what that meant, that everyone was given a day off, given 1 day out of 7 to rest. It's not just the Jews who had to rest, but their slaves, even if they were Gentile slaves, and their animals were not allowed to be put to work on the Sabbath. Animals were given a day of rest too. This is remarkable, remarkably progressive. And frankly, until recently, even in this country, until like about 100 years ago, people worked 6 days a week. And then they instituted the 5-day work week. You know, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a lot of upheaval. There were the beginning of labor unions, and there were all kinds of laws that were passed in the United States and in other parts of the world to give workers certain protections, to limit their working hours generally to 40 hours a week, 5 days a week. Prior to that, people went to work, if they worked in a factory, in a mill, like in a fabric mill, they would go to work. Women would left their farms. They went to New England and they worked in factories making shoes or making fabric, and they worked 6 days a week. That was the norm. Imagine if the law, and they went to church on Sunday. Okay, they didn't sleep in on Sunday. They got up and they went to church, and then they had Sunday afternoon off, and the whole thing started again on Monday. Imagine living in a time when there was no Sabbath provision, when people simply worked or were allowed to be worked, if they were a slave or a servant, by their master 7 days a week. Just imagine that. We have a weekend. We have 2 days off, right? If you're not expected to be working usually 6 days a week anymore. So I want you to appreciate the fact that this was considered very, very progressive. It's a very humane measure. So this was to allow the person to rest, to think about higher things, to worship God, and not simply spend every single day as an exercise in mere survival. So these kinds of regulations were not intended to be something that prevented a person from feeding themselves or being healed, which is what we're going to see in the next story after this, okay? But as time passed, a lot of additional regulations were passed, and many of the Jewish leaders, especially the religious leaders, became very preoccupied with exactly what kind of work could be done, what was allowed and what was not allowed. And you can understand why this kind of story is in the New Testament, because it was a question that was raised by the early church, because the early church knew that the Lord also sometimes broke the Sabbath regulations. So, of course, this would be a question that would rise up in the early Christian community. Remember that those very first Christians did not call themselves Christians. They simply considered themselves Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. They didn't think that they belonged to something new. So they weren't there saying to themselves, well, we're Christians now, we don't have to keep the law of Moses. They weren't saying that. They didn't think that they hadn't joined some other religion. They hadn't left Judaism. So you have to try to understand it in that context. So let's listen to St. John Chrysostom, whose feast day we're celebrating today, who was asking the question, why did the Lord break these laws? Okay? And by the way, when we're talking about the law of Moses, I want you to remember that the law of Moses is not the 10 commandments. The Lord didn't break the 10 commandments. Okay? We're talking about the law of Moses is 613 rules written down in the Old Testament, plus thousands of oral rules that had been developed over the 1,200 years from the time of Moses to the time of Jesus. Okay? Hundreds, thousands even, of rules had been developed and were kind of part of the oral tradition, and they were followed by the Pharisees, but not by the Sadducees, and not by all Jews, but by the majority of Jews, okay? So that's what we mean by law of Moses. Not just the written laws, it was never the 10 commandments, just the 10 commandments. It's 613 written laws plus thousands of additional rules that had developed over time. And that's the kind of thing that the Lord was objecting to primarily. Okay, so here's St. John Chrysostom talking about why the Lord broke these laws. It was his will, indeed, that the Sabbath be broken, but not simply, in other words, not just for its own sake, not simply so. Wherefore he never breaks it without a reason, but gives a reasonable excuse, that he might at once bring the law to an end and not startle them. They were not able to comprehend why he would break these, especially laws, especially being a rabbi. And of course, St. Paul later would address the question of the law of Moses and its role in the Christian life. And he come to realize that there was no purpose to the law, but they weren't ready to hear that immediately. It took time before the church began to understand this. So Chrysostom is saying that he doesn't want to startle them and totally upend their way of life. So he is trying to introduce this kind of concept of breaking the law for certain worthwhile purposes. So he says, as he said when he anointed with clay the eyes of the blind man, and said, "My Father works until now, and I work." That was an important statement, because it says in Genesis that God rested on the seventh day. And because God rested, he gave that example for the Jews to rest. But Jesus said, God never rests. God is always working. And so am I. And so this is what he said. But that's in the Gospel of John. He did this, Chrysostom says, to glorify his own Father, and by the other to soothe the infirmity of the Jews, for which he is laboring here, putting forward as the plea of necessity of nature, although the case of acknowledged sins, that could not, of course, ever be an excuse. In other words, you cannot say, why did the disciples pluck the grain and eat it? Because they were hungry. That's what Chrysostom means by necessity. But we can never use the argument of necessity, Chrysostom says, for sin. Okay, so Chrysostom says that can never be an excuse. Neither may the murderer make his anger a plea, an excuse, nor the adulterer allege his lust, or any excuse. But here, by mentioning their hunger, he freed the disciples of all blame. So how did the Lord defend his disciples? He gives the example of David. So it was so long ago that I read you the pericope. I'm not even sure if you remember what he said. When they criticized, he says, have you not read what David said? What David did when he was hungry. So when did David do this? David was fleeing from Saul, and he was accompanied by some of his friends and supporters, and they went into the tabernacle. This was before there was a temple, and they ate the bread of the presence, or the shewbread, that was placed out for the Lord every week. And the only people who were supposed to ever eat that were the priests. And David was not a priest, nor were his men. He ate it and he gave it to his men to eat. So it's kind of like a sacrilege, okay? And nobody ever criticizes David for that. Of course, but it's not just because he was a great king or even considered a prophet, which David is considered a prophet in the Old Testament because he wrote the Psalms, and many of the Psalms are prophetic. So the point is that even though he was this great king and he was a prophet, this was sacred bread that had been set out before God in the holy place. And nonetheless, he was not criticized for that because they were hungry and there was nothing else for them to eat because he was on the lam running from Saul, who wanted to kill him. Now, the argument from necessity is actually an argument that is applicable even in ordinary secular law. And occasionally this comes to fore. And this comes to the fore. This actually happens occasionally when there's an emergency. You could, for example, let's say somebody is badly injured and they're bleeding to death and someone nearby left their car running. You can take that injured person, put it in that person's car, and go to the hospital, and you would not be prosecuted for stealing, even though ordinarily just taking the car because it was running and it was there, that would be stealing. But if it's a necessity because somebody is in need of medical care, we actually saw that happen a couple years ago when there was a mass shooting here in Las Vegas, where people just found cars and they put injured people in the cars and they took them to hospital. That actually happened. Nobody would be prosecuted for that. So that is actually something that is understood as a reasonable defense. And that is what Jesus gives as a defense here. But notice he didn't stop with that. He did not stop with that. He said that, and have you not read that the priests profane the Sabbath? In other words, they break the Sabbath when they go to work in the temple, because that's work, right? And I've had a lot of people say to Father Costa, you're working on the Sabbath. Yes, he is. And that's exactly what Jesus is saying. But of course, that is an exception. And it is allowed because somebody has to take care of the worship of the Lord, even on the Sabbath. So, of course, they probably would not, the Jewish leaders who are criticizing the disciples for this activity, and they don't criticize Jesus for letting them do it. Elsewhere, they do criticize him. I think we saw that earlier where they said, why is it that your disciples do not eat with unwashed hands? So they're criticizing him indirectly, though, because he's allowing it. He's not picking the grape himself. He's not eating. They are, but he's allowing it. And that's an indirect criticism of him. But then he says something else, which is very important to them in defense of what they are doing. And he says this: there is something greater than the temple here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, and that's the disciples. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So, what does he mean? There is something greater than the temple here. What's greater than the temple? God. God, the one who is worshipped in the temple, is greater than the temple. And he's really referring to himself here. There are some scholars who disagree with that. Some say he's referring to something else and they give other things. I don't buy that. Jesus is clearly referring to himself. And we see that later from the last thing he says in this pericope. But he doesn't dwell on that because he quotes for them from the prophet Hosea in chapter 6 and sort of invites them to contemplate what Hosea said, which is the saying, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. That's the lesson they need to learn. Well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, first let's talk about why he calls himself greater than the temple. And how do I know that he's referring to himself? What's there? He says there's something greater than the temple here. Where? What? What is greater than the temple? It's the person who is worshipped in the temple. And I believe that he's referring to himself because he ends this little pericope, this little section, by saying the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Well, who's greater than the Sabbath? Who could be the Lord of the Sabbath? Not an ordinary human being. It only is God. God is the Lord of the Sabbath. He created the Sabbath. He creates the restrictions of the Sabbath. He gave the Sabbath. He has the authority to modify the Sabbath, to interpret the Sabbath laws, all of these things. So this kind of thing shows us that he is really not, in a kind of indirect way, claiming divinity. So people who say that Jesus never claimed divinity, this is an example of where he is claiming divinity. The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, Son of Man means me, myself. Now, it also is referring to a figure that Daniel saw in his vision. The Son of Man seated at the right hand of God, to whom God gives all authority. Now, it could mean both things. It could be this person that Daniel saw in his vision, or it could mean, in their ordinary speech, me, myself. And I think that the Pharisees suspected that Jesus was referring to himself, but they couldn't be sure. They would become sure later at his trial when he identifies himself as the Son of Man, the one whom Daniel saw in the vision. But right now they're not so sure, but it for us, especially looking in hindsight, it is clearly a claim of divinity, okay? So it's a very, very radical statement, and no ordinary Jew in his right mind would claim that kind of authority. But Jesus clearly is, because he's not an ordinary person. He's God, as we know. So what about this statement from Hosea chapter 6, verse 6? I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He has quoted that before. Do you remember? I'm sure it sounds familiar. He quoted that verse back in chapter 9 when he was being criticized by the scribes and the Pharisees for eating with tax collectors and sinners. He says, I have come not to call the righteous, but the sinners to repentance. And furthermore, the Lord said, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Go and learn the meaning of these words. So that's why this is, again, he reminds them of this, and this is so important. In other words, what does this have to do with the Sabbath anyhow? Oh, I just realized I've got so involved in the subject, I forgot to take a break. Let's take a quick break right now. When we come back, I'll talk about what this has to do with the Sabbath.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronima. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronima is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronima is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox, now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We are back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so what does this have to do with mercy? What does this have to do with the Sabbath? Because God made the Sabbath for the benefit of humanity, not so that he would just be worshiped. God doesn't need our worship. God does not need anything from us. So he made the Sabbath for our benefit. So it doesn't make sense to deprive people of the ability to eat when they're hungry on the Sabbath because some rule that was invented by human beings, okay? Because God said to rest on the Sabbath. He didn't say don't eat on the Sabbath. And if necessity requires that you pick grain so that you can eat, it's allowed. Now, what about some of those harsh rules in the Sabbath laws? And there were some very harsh rules and harsh penalties that were imposed in the actual written laws that we see in the Old Testament. Chrysostom talks about this, and he asks the question, why was the law so harsh to begin with? And then later it was kind of modified by the Lord. It was modified in terms of the strictness of its observance. And this is what St. John Chrysostom says. Because they could not have borne it if, when he was giving the law for the Sabbath, he had said, do your good works on the Sabbath, but do not do works which are evil. It makes sense, right? In other words, they would have just been working on the Sabbath. They weren't capable of only doing good works. Jesus's point is that on the Sabbath, we're allowed to do good works. The next story is going to illustrate that very well, okay? We are allowed to do good on the Sabbath, but we're not supposed to do evil on the Sabbath, all right? They would not have been able to differentiate between that. They wouldn't have said, hey, I want to do something evil, but I'll refrain. Because nobody who's observing the Sabbath is going to willingly do evil, all right? And nobody who cares about the Sabbath will be stopped by the fact that it is the Sabbath if they want to do something evil. Do you see my point? So they couldn't do that. So he had to say, no work on the Sabbath. now that they were farther along and able, he could modify that. That's what the Lord is doing. And by the way, so that's why the laws were harsher in the Old Testament. I'll come back to this in a minute. And this is, so he does not say, but he restrains them from all work. All right? For example, he said not, do your good works on the Sabbath, but do not do the works of evil. So he restrained them from all work alike. You must do nothing at all, he said. And not even then were they kept in order. In other words, they were still breaking the Sabbath. But he himself, in the very act of giving the law of the Sabbath, did there hint or signify that he will have them refrain from evil works only, by saying, you must do no work except when it is done for your life. In other words, even there in the Old Testament, there is an exception for saving someone's life. Okay, so it's not really no work at all. He's hinting at the fact that it could be modified, it could be eased, it could be relaxed for the right reason. This is Chrysostom's point. Thus, even by the very shadow, he was secretly opening them up to the truth. And that worked to a certain degree because there were exceptions. All right, there were exceptions to the rule of no work. And we're going to see that in the next story. Did then Christ say, did then Christ, it would be asked, repeal something so profitable? Far from it. No, he greatly enhanced it. So did the Lord do away with the Sabbath? We know. Or the law of Moses. What does it say in Matthew's gospel? He has come to fulfill it. So that does not mean that we continue to keep the rules that are set out or created for the Jews. So how did the Lord enhance it? He said he trained them to observe higher rules. It was unnecessary that someone's hands should be bound who was freed from wickedness in order to do good works, or that men should learn from this that God made all things, and that they should likewise be gentle and be called to imitate God. In other words, this is what the Lord meant when he said, I have come to not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. He is releasing us from these rigid requirements of the law. You can do nothing at all, and allowing us to do good. That's not allowed under the law for the Jews today. They're not allowed to go do something good, to carry a meal to a next door neighbor who is sick. They're not allowed to do that on the Sabbath because that means that they are carrying something. That's not allowed. You see what I'm trying to say? So another thing I wanted to point out, and Chrysostom was sort of hinting at this, but I get asked this question quite a bit, and this is why I'm talking about it. People ask, Chrysostom asks, why were the laws so strict? And his point was that if the Lord was lenient with them at the very beginning, they wouldn't have followed anything at all. Even though the law was strict, they were still breaking it. A similar question that I get asked about is, why didn't the Lord reveal himself to be Trinity? Why wasn't the Trinity clearly stated in the Old Testament? Because a lot of people will say, well, the Christians invented this later. This is not in the Old Testament. It is. We can see it in many places, how God is revealed as Trinity, but as Chrysostom would say, or the translators would say, darkly. He's kind of hinting at it. It's obscure. And the reason is because if God was revealed as Trinity, then they would be open to polytheism. They would not be able to understand what that meant, that God is one in three persons. They simply could not. We're talking about people in the law of Moses goes back to the year 1200 or 1250 BC. So you're talking about people who were very, very simple and very primitive, and they simply could not. God had to treat them like little children. So there are more rules that are placed on little children than we have on adults. Little children have a limited capacity for understanding certain concepts, so we don't expect that from them. Similarly, in the case here of the law of Moses, God was stricter with the Israelites in the beginning because they needed that. They needed more rules, and he had to be stricter so that they would be trained. But the relaxation of those rules is already there. And this is what Jesus is now introducing them to, a different way of understanding the law. Most of the Jews would not accept this, but many did. And those were the ones who followed Jesus as the Messiah. And of course, St. Paul completely revolutionizes their understanding of the law and how that fits in, okay, with their lives as Christians. So let us continue with the next story. It's another challenge on the Sabbath or to the Sabbath. And this is the story of the man with the withered hand. Now, I'm happy to talk to you about this story because there's something I think very useful we can talk about in terms of this story, and that is how each of the evangelists presents a common story in a way that is appropriate to their audience. So this story, the healing of the man with the withered hand, is in all three synoptics. The synoptic gospels, synoptic, synoptic, means they look alike or they appear similar, are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This story is in all three gospels, but the way Matthew tells it is different than how Mark and Luke tell the same story. And I want to discuss those differences so I can show you how each of the evangelists adapts a story to his particular audience. And there is nothing wrong with that. But first, I'm going to read for you how the story is told in Matthew's gospel. So you're going to just listen a little bit, okay? This is after the discussion with the Pharisees about picking grain on the Sabbath. And he went on from there and entered their synagogue. And behold, there was a man with a withered hand. And they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" That they might accuse him. And he said to them, "What man of you, if he has one sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And the man stretched it out, and it was restored, whole like the other. But the Pharisees went out and took counsel against him, how to destroy him. So that's how Matthew tells the story. Now, Luke and Mark both also tell the story. In Mark, it's in chapter 3, verse 1 to 6, and in Luke, it's in chapter 6. I'm going to read Mark's account. It's kind of interesting. They're very, very similar, but there's a couple little details. But now, anyhow, before I get to Mark's account, notice that the point of the Lord is that it's okay to work on the Sabbath if you're doing good things. Okay, that's his, but there's more to it than that. But that's his conclusion. And that's in keeping with what Chrysostom said about the fact that he was opening them up to the fact that there are exceptions. And because even the law of Moses, the written law of Moses itself, allows for an exception in the case of saving someone's life, then there would be exceptions. In other words, it's not a rigid law for which there were no exceptions. Let's listen to how Mark tells the story. Now, before I read it, I'm going to remind you about what Matthew said. Matthew said that he went to the synagogue, there was a man there with a withered hand, and the Jewish leaders asked the Lord. They initiate the conversation, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That's a rabbinic question. Is it lawful? Okay, that's a question you would ask a rabbi. This is a question. These are the kinds of issues that Jews even today debate and discuss. Is this thing that I want to do lawful, or was this thing that somebody did lawful? And what they mean is acceptable according to the law of Moses. That's what they mean by, is it lawful? But this is a question we hear even among Jews today, but definitely here in this gospel. Jesus So they ask him, this is Matthew's gospel, is it lawful? And Jesus gives a very rabbinic answer. He answers with a question. Okay, that's a very common rabbinic technique. He says, if you had a sheep that fell into a pit, wouldn't you take it out even if it was the Sabbath? And then he draws a conclusion from that. He makes an analogy, he asks a question, makes an analogy to the circumstance, and then draws a conclusion. This is a classic rabbinic response, okay? And he concludes, therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Okay, no, it's more than that. He says, a man is more valuable than a sheep. That's his conclusion. And then, therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Now, listen to how Mark tells the story. Mark chapter 3, verse 1. And he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. And they watched him to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. And he looked around at all of them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out and immediately took counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. All right. So Luke's, telling the story is very similar. He only mentions that it was the man's right hand, that the scribes and the Pharisees, he specifies who it was that were watching him, that they might accuse him, which, by the way, is also present in Matthew's gospel, etc., and how he called the man forward and put the man right in the middle and ask the question, what is the purpose of the Sabbath? To save life or to kill, to destroy, to do good or to do harm? What is the purpose of the Sabbath? So Luke and Mark's account is very similar. What I think is really interesting, I don't know if you caught it when I read it, but Mark does not shy away from saying that Jesus looked around. You can imagine the synagogue filled with people, and he asked the question, what is the purpose of the Sabbath? To do good or to do harm? And they refused to answer. And he looks at them with anger, Mark says, grieved at the hardness of their heart. In other words, they knew what he was getting at. They knew that he was right, but they refused to acknowledge it. And he was frustrated. And I think it's good to mention this. Now, Luke doesn't mention the anger. Matthew doesn't mention the anger. Sometimes we get a little bit uncomfortable with the idea that Jesus got angry, but it was a righteous anger. In other words, it's not like us where we lose our temper because somebody doesn't do what we wanted them to do or something like that, or we can't find a parking spot, or we were late for an appointment, or nothing like that, or somebody said something to offend us. He doesn't get offended. Have you noticed that? When he heals the man who has 6,000 demons in him, legion, and then the people in the town, rather than being grateful, they ask him to leave. He doesn't get offended. He just gets in the boat and he leaves. So that's how we would get angry. We would be angry because of pride, but he gets angry because it's a righteousness. He's angry at their hardness of heart. They refuse to accept what he's saying, even though they know he's right. So I don't think we should shy away from saying that the Lord got angry. This isn't a sin, because even in the scriptures it says, be angry, but do not sin. So we can be angry over things that are unjust, but we don't get angry because somebody insults us or something like that. That's not acceptable. But I want to talk to you about how the story is presented differently in Mark and Luke versus Matthew, and I want to talk about that. I think that's very useful for us to understand the style and the purpose of the evangelists and why they tell the story in a way that's a little bit different, okay? So This time I remember the time for the break. It's time for our break. So let's take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about that, okay?
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Hello, this is L. Joseph Latender. I'm happy to announce the release of my new book, When You Give, Ancient Answers and Contemporary Questions. In this companion volume to When You Pray and When You Fast, I juxtapose scriptural and patristic admonitions about almsgiving with a look at contemporary issues that make it sometimes difficult to see our way forward in this regard. Along with the rationale for almsgiving, I offer practical suggestions for how almsgiving can work in our lives as modern Christians. When You Give is now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
Okay, so we're in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 12, the second pericope, the story of the man with the withered hand. And this story is told slightly differently in Mark and Luke than in Matthew's Gospel. So let's talk about what Mark and Luke do not have that Matthew does have. I'm not sure if you remember it. And also there's a little bit of a difference in the way the story is presented. In Mark and Luke, Jesus enters the synagogue and he knows they're watching him to accuse him. That's universal in all three of these Gospels. They are hoping, and we'll see as we progress through the Gospel of Matthew, that the opposition to Jesus becomes stronger and sharper, and they're really plotting, very actively plotting to get rid of him. And we're only in chapter 12, of course. That actually happens in chapter 1 of Mark's Gospel. They're plotting to get rid of him and try to find a way to trip him up and trap him and things like this. But the point is that all of them agree on that. In Mark and Luke, Jesus asks the question, what is the purpose of the Sabbath? To save life or to destroy it or to kill? In Matthew's Gospel, they ask the question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Because they know Jesus had a reputation. If it were up to us, if we only had the Gospels, we would assume Jesus only healed on the Sabbath. Of course, that's not true. He healed every day. But the point is, he didn't not heal on the Sabbath. He didn't refrain from healing on the Sabbath because of the rule. That's why we see these Sabbath controversy stories in the Gospels, because it engendered a lot of controversy. They ask him the question. And why is that? Because let's talk about the audience. We have a different presentation here because Mark and Luke have a Gentile audience. And Matthew has a Jewish audience or Jewish Christian audience. Mark and Luke don't ask the question, is it, in other words, in Mark and Luke, they're presenting the discussion in a more general philosophical way. What is the reason why God gave us a day of rest? Do you understand? It's more of a philosophical discussion that Jesus raises to defend himself, knowing that they were going to be critical of what he was going to do, which is to heal the man with a withered hand. Whereas in Matthew's Gospel, it was common for a rabbi to be asked, is it lawful to? And then Jesus is asked that question, and then he gives a rabbinic answer. And the rabbinic answer is quoting or citing a provision of the law of Moses. So Matthew is writing to a Jewish Christian audience that is familiar with the law of Moses, familiar with the exception that if one of your animals, a sheep, falls into a pit on the Sabbath day, you are allowed to pull it out of the pit, even though that's work. Why? To save the animal. And then Jesus, in a typical rabbinic fashion, takes that analogy and says, if you're allowed to save an animal, why aren't you allowed to save a human being? Why aren't you allowed to help a human being on the Sabbath? So that discussion about the sheep falling into the pit and the question of is it lawful to, that is not in Mark and Luke, because their audience, being Gentiles, would not have understood that kind of a conversation. They wouldn't have any frame of reference for Jesus's reference of which one of you, the reference to the sheep and falling to the pit, that is an exception to the strictness of the law. You see what my point? So I think this is a very good example of why we see a different presentation sometimes among the different evangelists, and that they choose to include certain details or to exclude certain details. And this does not mean that they're unreliable. But if you listen to some people today, they will say, the evangelists don't agree. There's discrepancies in the Bible. They say different things. In this one, they say that Jesus asked the question. And in this gospel, they say the Pharisees asked the question. In this gospel, Jesus talks about the ram or the sheep that falls into the pit. And in that one, he doesn't mention it. And the Bible is full of all these different discrepancies and all of these differences, and they're in conflict with each other. And I just want you to see how ridiculous that argument is. Yes, they tell the story in a different way because they have a different audience. So whenever an evangelist is writing, forget about just the evangelist, any author has to write in such a way that their audience, that their readers or their hearers understand them. And so they try to relate it to something in their culture. Just like I just did when I was talking about the necessity of the law, and I mentioned a recent episode where people literally stole people's cars to help people who had been shot in Las Vegas and take them to the hospital. That's a reference to something that you would understand or remember. So that's okay. That doesn't mean that the Bible isn't trustworthy. That doesn't mean that there's discrepancies and disagreements among the evangelists. This kind of thing is said by people who are critical of the Bible, and you should ignore it. Okay? Ignore it. Now, this kind of thing is it's not that the fathers or the early Christians didn't know about these things. They said, for example, our hero of the day, St. John Chrysostom, he would have said, these things are da mikra. In other words, mikra is where we get the word micro from. Little things, tiny things, insignificant details. Is there any difference in the outcome? Is there any difference in the Lord's conclusion? Is there any difference in, the fact of the healing, what was withered? You see what I'm trying to say? In all the important matters, they're in agreement. So if this evangelist chooses not to have the rabbinic discussion because he's got a Gentile audience, what's the problem there? Okay, so you should not be, I know people sometimes write to me and they say, I read this, and there's lots of discrepancies and there's lots of differences in the manuscripts. People get all worried. Don't worry about that. Okay, have confidence in the scriptures. Okay, the problem is us. The problem is not the Bible. The problem is always us. Okay, and if we don't understand something or it doesn't make sense, the problem is not the scriptures. The problem is us. Okay, so Matthew gives this classic, Matthew has the Lord giving this classic rabbinic answer. He gives an answer. First, he asks the question. He answers the question with a question because they know that exception about the sheep. And then from this, he says, if you're allowed to do this, or he's implying, he says, how much more value is a man than a sheep? If you're allowed to do this for a sheep, you should certainly be allowed to help a human being who is in distress on the Sabbath, okay? So he makes this analogy and then gives his conclusion. Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And of course, in all three Gospels, the ultimate end of the little pericope is that they all went out to take counsel how to destroy him, okay? Now, you might wonder yourself why the healing on the Sabbath engendered such a harsh response by these Jewish leaders. This is something, again, we find difficult to understand because we get the Lord's rationale. We understand it. Because Jesus was a rabbi, and he's called rabbi, right? That means as a teacher, he was expected to teach the law of Moses. And the violations for breaking the Sabbath law were considered very severe. And there was the constant effort on the part of most rabbis and Pharisees and scribes was to encourage people to keep the laws. And they believed that this is what set them apart from the Gentiles. This is what made them acceptable in the eyes of the Lord, that they kept the law of Moses. This is what made them a holy nation. And there's something else involved. I'm not sure if this is what is behind this objection to Jesus healing on the Sabbath. I mean, that's considered a really big deal to break the Sabbath laws. But as a rabbi, Jesus was setting, I'm sure in their opinion, a very bad example as a rabbi. Eating with tax collectors and sinners, violating these Sabbath rules and things like this. Now, in the Bible, it doesn't say you can't heal on the Sabbath. It says, it gives the exception for necessity, like the sheep that falls into the pit. So you were allowed to heal if somebody's life was in danger, but where does that exception come from? It comes from the oral regulations that were developed over many, many centuries by the Pharisees. So the Pharisees had developed their own laws, their own rules, and then they said these are binding for everybody. In other words, they expected everyone to follow. These were man-made rules. God didn't say you can't heal on the Sabbath. God never said that. God said don't do any work on the Sabbath. And there were a couple of exceptions. If somebody's life was in danger or your animal's life was in danger, there was an exception. But to say you can't heal on the Sabbath, that specific thing was an elaboration or a development that took place later. Well, what kind of work could you do versus what kind of work can you not do? And so they enumerated these things. And Jesus violated not the law that God had created, but the laws that these people, men, had created. You see, that's why he criticizes them for following their own traditions. And by the way, when they wanted to find a loophole around the law, they found one or they made one. Okay, so he criticizes that too. But the keeping of the Sabbath was considered essential, and it was so important that that the Jews believed that if every Jew on the planet kept a perfect Sabbath and did no work, the Messiah would come. This is what they believed. So here is Jesus, the actual Messiah, and he's messing up this whole plan to get the Messiah to come. And they were always encouraging people to keep the Sabbath, keep the Sabbath, keep the Sabbath. And they could never imagine that the Messiah would actually be one who might violate the Sabbath. The Messiah would not be one who would be eating with tax collectors and sinners. The Messiah would never heal on the Sabbath. So Jesus was a very scandalous figure to many of these Jewish leaders who simply could not accept what he was doing in terms of the laws. Anyhow, we have a caller. It's an anonymous person. I don't know if I'm allowed to say the place for him. So why don't we go ahead and welcome our caller. Welcome, anonymous caller, to Search the Scriptures.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thanks for calling in. What is your question or comment?
Oh, sure. Can I just say I love your show. You're a gift to the church, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. So the question has to do with, it's kind of the two pericope in question here. The second one, I can see, I'm listening to you kind of focusing on, it seems that life or the priority of life is sort of the focus of that one.
Yes.
Yeah, so is it possible that that's actually the focus of the first one as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Okay, so then to kind of build on that.
So, the value of the human person, they wouldn't have starved to death if they didn't pick the grain and eat it. But the point is that what ties both of them is the idea of the value of the human person, and the fact that God did not make the Sabbath simply to have us observe a rule, but for our benefit. That's why I started the program by talking about the purpose of the Sabbath. Okay, but go ahead and build on that, Anonymous.
Sure. Okay, so then the question becomes, is it possible that Jesus is using Son of Man in the way that it's used in Ezekiel, referring to a man or any man? Yeah.
No, because here he's not saying that the sons of men can break the Sabbath out of necessity. He said the Son of Man, and as a single person, is Lord of the Sabbath. And that he would have to be saying that any human being is master of the Sabbath and has the right to make the rules of the Sabbath. And I don't think he was saying that.
Well, but I guess that's not my point.
Okay.
So in the second pericope, you say, hey, look, he's making a very rabbinic response, right? A question to a question. And so I think what I'm saying here is in the first one, it's also a rabbinic response. He's actually answering with Torah precedents.
That's right.
Okay, and he builds a kal va'achomer argument, which is a light and weighty, or I think it's called a fortiori, in other terms. So
yes.
So he's building on that. I guess my point is why cite David and all of the Torah precedents if he could have just said, well, I'm Lord of the Sabbath and I get to make the rules.
Yeah,
I mean, why even cite the rest of the stuff? Because
this is what Chrysostom was talking about. They were not able to handle that. So by showing the precedent of necessity and sometimes an easing of the restriction, that he was pointing to them the fact that sometimes the Sabbath rules were eased, and that he was sort of preparing them for the fulfillment of the law. So in the way we have it today, where we don't keep those kinds of rules. Do you understand what I'm saying? I think that's what Chrysostom was getting at. Yeah.
Sure.
Why proclaim himself? Yeah. Why proclaim himself Lord of the Sabbath? Why say that? I don't know. I'd have to. We were saying the law that calls for the operation of his mind, and I think he said these things even though they could not accept it, so that we later would understand why he felt that why he had the authority. The disciples.
Okay,
go ahead.
Okay, I guess can you just humor me real quick? Let's just say that he was referring to any man, and in this case, the priority of life is sort of the end goal. And so when he says greater than the temple, just like there's other shorthand in Scripture, like when I don't know if it's Paul says he's referring to the Passover, and he could he can mean Passover lamb. He could mean the entire festival. If Jesus here is saying greater than the temple, couldn't he just be referring to the temple service, because that's the precedent that he's been building on the entire time?
How does that fit the context? He's not talking about temple service.
Yeah, he is though,
but he's talking about the priest.
Remember, he refers to David, right, who enters the temple.
Okay.
And
I say that that temple service is greater. That's the thing that's greater than the temple is the service in the temple.
No. What he's saying here is the priority of life. His disciples harvesting grain is what ends up being the thing he's driving toward.
Greater than the temple.
He's building an argument of precedent. Yeah.
So you're thinking that maybe it's just the idea of human life is greater than the temple. You wouldn't be alone in that. That's why I said that there are other opinions about what he means by greater than the temple. I kind of come to the conclusion that he's referring to himself, because there are places elsewhere in this gospel where he says there's something greater than Solomon here. There's something greater than Jonah here. And he's referring to himself in those cases. And because he says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, that's why I think he's referring to himself. But you would not be, alone in that interpretation. So I think I wouldn't say you're wrong. And maybe there's a multi-level interpretation there that's possible. Something can have more than one meaning, in the Bible. There definitely human life is greater than the temple. That's for sure. God would agree with that. Is there anything else?
No, I like that. I just meant to say thank you. I appreciate your time.
Very good. Well, thanks for calling. Maybe next time if you call, you'll let us know your name. But I thank you for calling. Yeah. Okay, God bless. Good night. Yeah. Okay. All right, so that's a good point. So anyhow, I'm glad you folks are all thinking about these things, and it's okay to challenge me that you don't agree with that interpretation. It means something. I can't prove what it means. This is the conclusion I came to. Why the Lord, let's talk about St. John Chrysostom on why the Lord confronted the scribes and Pharisees. Here's what he said. It was his desire to cure them. He tried innumerable ways of healing, both by what he did in their presence and by what he said. But since their malady was incurable, he proceeded to the work. In other words, he's trying to convince them of these things. And so he tells the man with the withered hand, stretch forth your hand, and it was healed. And what did they do? They went out, they took counsel to try to destroy him. And after this, let's go ahead and talk about what comes after this, because after this, Matthew kind of wraps up with a quotation from the prophecy of Isaiah in this case. And it says that because the Lord knew that they were conspiring against him, in verse 15, this is Matthew 12, verse 15, it says, Jesus, aware of this, withdrew from there. And Chrysostom notes the fact that the Lord did not fight them. He tried to convince them, but he did not fight them. He withdrew from there, and many followed him, and he healed them all, and he ordered them not to make him known. And Chrysostom says, what did the Lord do? He withdrew. And knowing their devices, knowing their plans, he withdrew from there. And he said he withdrew from them. Now, this is kind of interesting because at this point, Chrysostom says, where are they now who say that miracles ought to be done? Okay, in other words, where now are they who say that miracles ought to be done? And the point is that there were some people in the congregation that said, why aren't there miracles happening today? We could say the same thing. Obviously, we know that miracles happen today, but not with the kind of abundance that we saw happening in the era of the early church. And Chrysostom answers, by these things, he signified that the unopened soul is not even persuaded thereby. In other words, miracles don't convince people. Okay, that's not why the Lord did the miracle. He tried to appeal to these Jewish leaders and explain to them the purpose of the Sabbath, to help the human person, the value of life, as our caller mentioned. All of these things were to help the human person, and to get this, the purpose of the Sabbath was God-given for our benefit, not to just create rules and obstacles to doing good for other people on the Sabbath. And then he does the miracle. Now, what's the significance then of the miracle? It proves that he has the authority to teach the way he does, to do what he does, to make the pronouncements like the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. The miracle proves it. You understand what I'm trying to say? That should have been, because the Jews are all about signs, about miracles. Show us a sign, they would say. Show us a sign. Do a miracle. Prove to us that you are who you claim to be. That's what they were always saying. But even when he did miracles, like right there in their presence, the same thing. There's another similar story, and that is the healing of the paralytic. When Jesus says to him, your sins are forgiven. And they said, who is he to forgive sins? Only God can forgive. And he says, that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. I say to you, and he says to the paralytic, get up and walk, right? So you see there that the sign, the miracle is intended to show, to affirm that he has the authority to act and to say what he says and does. Okay, to teach as he does, to act as he does. The sign is considered proof to a person with an open mind. And this is why Chrysostom says people are complaining that we don't have so many miracles today. But he says that alone is not going to convince someone who is unwilling to believe. And he's right, right? So we end here with a little statement, a little pericope, a little quotation from the book of Isaiah. And notice that Matthew introduces it with a fulfillment formula, something we haven't heard for a while. This is in verse 17. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. Behold, my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he shall proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed or quench a smoldering wick until he brings justice to victory. And in his name the Gentiles will hope. So this is showing the reason why he's quoting this here. Matthew, remember that Matthew quotes from the Old Testament, quotes from the Jewish scriptures twice as often as all the other evangelists combined. Why? Because he has a Jewish Christian audience. And he's showing that Jesus is the Messiah because he has fulfilled these prophecies. What is a prophecy? That the Lord would send his servant, his chosen one. And this is a title we see sometimes for Jesus in the Gospels. My beloved, with whom my soul is pleased. Isn't that what God the Father said about the Son at the baptism? This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Didn't he call him the beloved Son at the transfiguration? And the chosen one. This is my chosen one, my beloved Son. I will put my spirit upon him. And this is why in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus opens the Gospel and when he comes to Nazareth and said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. So all of these things are fulfillment of prophecy. And we see that the Spirit of the Lord is upon him because he's performing all of these remarkable miracles. And here is what Chrysostom says about this little passage from Isaiah, which is intended to remind the Jews and the Jewish Christians that the Lord Jesus Christ was the one who fulfilled the prophecies. He is the one who brought all of this healing to Israel. No one had done anything like that since, and no one had done anything like it before. Certainly there were wonder workers in ancient Israel, and there are miracle workers even today. We have the saints, but nothing like the Lord, nothing even approaching that. So here's St. John Chrysostom talking about this passage. The prophet Isaiah celebrates his meekness and his unspeakable power and opens to the Gentiles a great door, and foretells also the ills that are to overtake the Jews, and signifies that he is unanimous with the Father. For behold, he said, my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. Now, if God the Father chose him, then Christ does not set aside the law as an adversary. That's a very good point. So they were saying that Jesus is breaking the Sabbath law, but the signs that he did should show that he is the Messiah that God said that he would send. And he's not breaking the law because he's an adversary of God, which is what they're about to say and what they will charge him with being, but because he is the chosen one. He's the beloved one. So Chrysostom says, if he chose him, Christ does not set aside the law as an adversary, nor as being an enemy of the lawgiver, but as having the same mind with him and the same objectives. Then, proclaiming his meekness, he said, He shall not strive nor cry. For his desire indeed was to heal in their presence. But since they thrust him away, he did not even contend against this. In other words, the Lord did not fight them when they rejected him. His purpose was to heal them, their minds, not just to heal the bodies of those who are sick, but here he's talking about the Jewish leaders, to heal them, to bring about their correction, to bring about their understanding. But when they didn't understand and they still rejected him, he didn't fight them. He just left. He withdrew from there, as Matthew says. And intimating both his might and his weakness. In other words, Isaiah here suggesting both that the Lord had strength, had might, and meekness. He said, a bruised reed he shall not break. For it was easy to break them all to pieces like a reed, not a reed merely, but one already bruised. And a smoking flax he will not quench. He sets forth both their anger that is kindled and his might, that he might be able to put down their anger and quench it with ease, whereby his mildness is signified. So we have reached the end of verse 23 here in Matthew chapter 12, and next week the challenges continue right here in chapter 12, as the Lord is accused of casting out demons by the power of the devil. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation that we have next week. But it leads, that accusation leads to one of the most discussed passages of the New Testament, and that has to do with the sin against the Holy Spirit. What does that mean? And we're going to talk about that next week. It's a very important conversation, and I hope you'll join us then with it. And now let's close with our prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word, for our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel. Amen. Good night.